Before I start, I want to mention that today there are many branches of Buddhism, each with their own Tripitakas or sacred text, encompassing an array of beliefs and rituals. There are Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and Zen Buddhism. As a result, modern-day followers practice a version of Buddhism that is quite different from what the original Buddhism that was taught by Buddha. However, if we examine the original teachings of Buddhism, we will find commonalities with Christianity. And in this video, I will highlight their common goals, and I would go one step further to support the notion that the answer Buddha was looking for, the original answer that he was looking for, is in the Gospel. Now, we do that by looking at the fundamental tenets of Buddhism, which are the Four Noble Truths, and then applying the Gospel truth to each one of them. And you will find that each of the truths builds up to this realization that we cannot be saved or attain enlightenment by our own efforts alone, and we require a Savior who will come in the end to end death and suffering. So let us start. Let us first look at each of these Four Noble Truths. The first Noble Truth is that life consists of suffering, and that Buddha, when he came out of the palace, he saw pain, death, disease, and social injustice, and spent, as a result, many years pondering over how to solve humanity's suffering. Now, similarly, in the Bible, the Apostle Paul also saw the sorrows of the world. In Romans chapter 8, verse 22, I quote, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning as the pains of childbirth right up to the present time." Now, ever since the fall of man from the first sin, the world has plunged into a never-ending cycle of suffering. King Solomon said in Ecclesiastes that life under the sun, that is, the natural life without God, is meaningless. So there is, in a sense, commonality between the first noble truth of Buddhism and the teachings in the Bible. And this commonality is the recognition that the world is a cycle of never-ending suffering. Now, the second noble truth states that desire or sin is the cause of suffering, meaning that everything in the natural world is created, and therefore all creations are impermanent because people and things change, they decay or they die. And if we base the ultimate purpose in life on desiring and yearning and being attached to impermanent things or created things, we would live a totally unfulfilled life when these things change. Now, Buddha called this the cycle of life or the cycle of suffering. He regards this as an imperfect state of existence that never ends if we did nothing about it. So the cause of suffering is therefore the desire for things that are impermanent, and desire is synonymous with karma or sin. In fact, the Thai language for karma is defined as sin or death. Now, in the Bible, it says, in James chapter 1, verse 14 to 15, it says, "But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death." Now, the Bible tells us that our sin separates us from God, who is the only source of life, and therefore sin is the root of all evil, and the logical conclusion of sin is death. You can see that in Romans 6:23. So again, there is commonality between Buddhism and what the Bible taught. Now, let's get to the third noble truth, and it states that to end suffering, we need to eliminate desire. In essence, this truth says that if we got rid of sin, then we would eliminate desire. However, Buddha went deeper. He taught through his parables that humanity has an innate corruption that exists within the self, and because it sits within self, this innate corruption cannot be defeated or eliminated by an individual's own effort. Because any effort by the individual to eliminate this innate corruption is an existential threat to self, and this innate corruption will never relent power to the individual. Now this was similarly seen in the Bible. In Galatians chapter 5 verse 17, I quote, "For the flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want." Now Buddha recognized this, and then he taught that this inner corruption can only be defeated by a power external to self and external to the natural world. Now this power, therefore, must come from the supernatural world. And this is also expressed in the Bible. In Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5 to 6, it says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." Now that was Noble Truth 3. Now we have the Noble Truth number 4, which introduces the Eightfold Noble Path. Now Buddha here originally taught that an enlightened person will demonstrate the characteristics listed in the Eightfold Noble Path, which is to behave ethically and has a disciplined mind and have wisdom. Now I emphasize these are the evidence of enlightenment, much like what James chapter 2 verse 18 was talking about. In the Bible it says, "I will show you my faith by my works." Now James described that works is an evidence of a person's salvation, not a means to salvation. This last truth of Buddhism is in essence where we most effectively can share the gospel. Now the majority of Buddhists interpret this truth as controlling the body and mind in order to end desire or sin. But that was not what Buddha taught. Buddha recognized that disciplining the body cannot end desire or sin because the innate corruption or sinful nature of humanity. Buddha did not intend for the Eightfold Noble Path to be a method for achieving enlightenment. Rather, he enumerated them to outline the characteristics of an enlightened person. You see the difference here. This is where we apply the gospel truth using Ephesians and James. Ephesians in chapter 2 verse 8 to 9 emphasize that works is not a means of achieving salvation. And according to Buddhist parables, it is impossible for humans to follow all the rules in the Eightfold Noble Path. The sacred text, which is the Tripitaka, outlines 227 rules for men and 311 rules for women. Now, modern-day Buddhists acknowledge that their innate corruption, which is sinful nature, makes it impossible to follow all the rules, and as a result, additional help is required to achieve enlightenment. The teachings of Buddha states that a future bodhisattva, called the Holy One, will arise and possess the power to impart goodness or righteousness to humanity, aiding them in overcoming their inherent corruption. Now, does this not sound like salvation through grace in Ephesians 2:8? This passage affirms the righteousness is a gift from God, not the result of individual efforts. And in James chapter 2 verse 18, on the other hand, describes the behavior and character traits or works of a person who is already saved by grace through genuine faith. So similarly, Buddha listed the Eightfold Noble Path to identify the grievousness of karma or sin and used them as a behavioral trait to identify the enlightened one. Buddha simply said, after you are enlightened, the traits or the fruits of the enlightenment are right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right awareness, and right concentration. James 2:18 says, "I will show you my faith by my works." It teaches that works is evidence of the saved person's genuine faith. Now, modern Buddhists misconstrue Buddhist teaching and view the Eightfold Noble Path as a rigid set of guidelines to achieve enlightenment. So in conclusion, what this means is that the Christian doctrine of saved by grace through faith is the answer Buddha was looking for to escape the cycle of life. That is why the gospel is indeed good news for a Buddhist, as Buddha was pointing to the way in the future, which is coming in the form of the Holy One. In fact, Buddha went further and taught that humanity's innate corruption or sinful nature can only be eradicated by the Holy One who will be coming in the future. Or Mahayana Buddhism teaches that the Holy One, called the Maitreya Buddha, will come to end death and all suffering and usher in love The Cambodian Tripitaka, which is a Buddhist sacred text, describes this Holy One as, and I quote, "This Holy One will rescue the world once and for all, and he will have scars on his hands and feet like the shape of a gonjak," which is a sharp cutting instrument. "There will be stab wounds on his side as well as blemishes and scars on his forehead," unquote. Who do you think this Holy One is then that Buddha was talking about? So can you see that Buddhism and Christianity have a common goal? There are many differences in the way truth is being communicated, but in the end, the answer that Buddha was looking for is the gospel offered by the Holy One, who is Jesus Christ.